For my 18th birthday, my parents gifted my brother a job at dad's firm while telling me to try waitressing for perspective. She can't even hold a tray right, my brother laughed. A year later, I bought the building their office rented in. You can stay, I said. Rent's just tripled though. I always thought of my family as a bit dysfunctional. Sure, we went through the motions, dinners, holidays, the occasional family outing where we'd all pretend we were happy, but I always felt like an outsider. Not in the way that makes you feel special, but in the way that makes you wonder if you're even part of the same family. Growing up, it was always clear that my older brother, Ryan, was the favorite. He was athletic, outgoing, and had a certain charm that made him the center of attention. My dad, Charles, was a successful businessman who owned an architectural design firm. Ryan was everything Dad had wanted in a son, smart enough to pass through school, but more importantly, he fit the right image. He was always given preferential treatment. I, on the other hand, didn't fit their mold. I was more creative, introspective, and spent more time drawing or reading than playing sports or joining the family's social circles. So when my 18th birthday rolled around, I expected something, I don't know, a little more meaningful than what I got. I thought maybe I'd be handed some kind of opportunity, something that showed my parents thought I was capable of doing something on my own. But instead, what I got was disappointing. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," my mom said absent-mindedly as she handed me a small gift box, something wrapped in cheap paper. My dad didn't even acknowledge it. He was too busy in his home office, making phone calls about work, like always. I opened the gift to find a plain necklace. "It's beautiful," I said, trying to mask the disappointment I felt. I wasn't the materialistic type, but it felt like nothing more than a token gesture. Ryan, of course, was getting something far more substantial. My dad, with his usual overconfidence, announced to the family that Ryan had just landed a job at his firm. "It's a big step for you, son," Dad said, his voice full of pride. "You'll be starting full-time next Monday. Welcome aboard." Ryan grinned, thrilled by the attention. "Thanks, Dad. I won't let you down." I couldn't help but feel the pit in my stomach. It was as if I wasn't even there. No one turned to look at me. No one thought I was capable of doing something similar. "And for you, Iris," my mom said, breaking the silence, her voice somehow colder than usual. "We thought it might help if you worked for a while, get some real perspective on what the world is like." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "You'll be waitressing," my mom continued, her tone casual as though it was the most natural thing in the world. "It's a great way to learn hard work and humility. You'll figure it out." I stood there for a moment, trying to process it. Waitressing. For my 18th birthday, they thought I needed a reality check. I wasn't going to inherit a job at the family firm like Ryan. I wasn't going to follow in my dad's footsteps. No, I was supposed to learn how to serve people. Ryan laughed at that. It wasn't a real, affectionate laugh, it was the kind of laugh that made you feel small, like you were a joke. "She can't even hold a tray right," he joked, nudging Dad with his elbow. Dad chuckled, not bothering to look at me. "She'll learn. It'll do her good." I felt my cheeks burn. Was this really what they thought of me? Was this all they thought I could do? But I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Not then. I just nodded and forced a smile, excusing myself from the conversation and retreating to my room. That night, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about what they'd said, about how little they thought of me. The next few weeks were some of the hardest I'd ever experienced. I started waitressing at a local diner, one of those places that's always packed with loud, demanding customers and overly caffeinated waitstaff. It was a sharp contrast to the life I had imagined for myself, one where I could make a real impact, one where I wasn't just another face in the crowd. The work was exhausting. I was constantly on my feet, rushing around, taking orders, trying to balance drinks and plates. The tips were barely enough to cover rent. But I learned something important during those months. I learned that I could survive anything. Even though my parents had thrown me into this job with the sole intention of showing me that I wasn't as special as I thought, it showed me just how strong I really was. I started to save. I didn't care about the small tips or the exhaustion anymore. I worked double shifts, stayed late, and learned how to balance my time. In my off hours, I started to educate myself. I took online courses in business and real estate. I read books about investment and financial independence. One day, while scrolling through real estate listings, I came across something that caught my eye: the office building where my dad's firm rented space. It wasn't cheap, but I knew it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The owner of the building was selling, and I saw an opening. My mentor, a local businesswoman I had met while working at the diner, helped me put together the money. It wasn't easy, but I managed. It took a lot of hard work, a lot of sacrifice, but I did it. I bought the building. I remember the moment so clearly. I stood in the lobby of the office building, looking at the modern glass walls that my dad's firm had called home for so long. I wasn't nervous. I was proud. I had done something that, just a year ago, I would have thought was impossible. The first thing I did was call my dad's office. I didn't give them any warning. I wanted to let them know exactly who was in control now. "I'm Iris Montgomery," I said when his assistant answered. "I just wanted to let you know that I purchased the building your firm rents space in." There was silence on the other end, followed by an awkward cough. You own this building?" "Yep," I said. "And just so you know, rent's going up. It's tripled." I hung up before she could say anything else. When I saw my parents again, things were different. My dad's firm was still in the building, but now they had to deal with the consequences of my decision. The tripled rent was a shock to them, of course, but I didn't care. This was my moment. I had earned this. "You really did it," my dad said when I finally saw him. "You bought the building? But, why?" "Why?" I said, trying to hold back the frustration. "Because I could. Because you've been telling me for years that I wasn't capable of anything. You told me I'd never make it. But look at me now." Ryan, who had been quiet until that point, finally spoke up. "So, what now? You own the building. What's next?" I smiled. "Well, you can stay. But the rent's tripled. It's business." Ryan looked at me with something I hadn't seen in a long time: respect. I didn't need them to approve of me anymore. I had built this for myself. I had proven that I could do more than they ever imagined. And that was all I ever really wanted. The story isn't finished yet. I'm still figuring out what comes next, but I've learned a lot along the way. If you're in a similar situation where you feel overlooked or underestimated, remember that you have the power to change your story. You don't need anyone's approval to make it happen. I had taken control, but the aftermath wasn't as simple as just buying the building and raising the rent. There were a lot of things I had to deal with, a lot of emotions to process. The moment I had envisioned, my family finally acknowledging me, seeing my worth, didn't come as smoothly as I had hoped. The reality was messy, as it always is with family. For weeks after the deal was done, I'd get messages from my parents, my dad mostly, trying to negotiate. They wanted to keep things the way they were, with their cushy office space, without having to deal with the fact that someone outside the family was now in control. The requests weren't even subtle. They would call and ask if I'd reconsider the rent hike or if I'd throw in some sort of discount for them. It was almost like they didn't understand that this wasn't about their convenience anymore, it was about my independence. My hard work. But there was no way I was backing down. I wasn't some charity. I wasn't their little girl anymore who could be manipulated or placated with a gift here and there. And yet, despite that resolve, there were moments when doubt crept in. I thought about the way they used to look at me. The way they spoke to me when I was younger, like I was always second best. I wondered if this was some twisted form of karma. Had I really risen above them? Or had I just stepped into their world, becoming part of the very machine I had spent my life trying to avoid? That first conversation with my parents after the building purchase was a lot more tense than I anticipated. When they invited me over to their house for dinner, I thought maybe it was an olive branch. I thought maybe, after all this time, they would acknowledge my success, my hard work, and treat me like an equal. I wasn't naive, but I had hoped. Instead, it was more like they were trying to manipulate me into giving them a break on rent. Over dinner, my mom's eyes darted around the room, avoiding direct contact. Dad was the first to speak. "Iris, you don't have to do this," he started, setting down his glass of wine, like the conversation had been rehearsed in his head. "The rent increase, it's too much. We've been your family for years. This is your dad's firm. You can't possibly want to make things harder for us." I tried to keep my voice steady, despite the anger that was building in me. "No, Dad, I don't want to make things harder for you. I just want to make things fair. This building is mine now. I worked for it. You didn't give it to me, and I didn't take anything from you. All I'm asking is for you to pay the new rent. That's how it works." Ryan, sitting at the table with his usual smirk, finally piped up. "You've really changed, Iris. A year ago, you were waitressing. Now you're trying to act like you're some big-shot businesswoman." That hurt. But it didn't surprise me. Ryan had always seen me as something less, something to be looked down on. But that was exactly why I was doing what I was doing. To prove that I wasn't just anything. "I didn't change, Ryan," I said slowly, making sure he heard every word. "I just stopped letting you or anyone else tell me who I should be. I did what you thought I couldn't. Now you'll have to pay the price for your own choices." Ryan's smile faltered a little, and I could see that the jab had hit its mark. He was used to having things handed to him. This was different for him. The power dynamic had shifted. It wasn't just about the money. I knew my parents saw it as some sort of rebellion, but to me, it was about finally standing up for myself. For once, I was calling the shots, and they weren't going to oppress me into submission. But after that dinner, things started to get tense. My dad, never one to admit defeat, kept trying to reason with me, but it was clear that what I had done cut deeper than he was willing to admit. It wasn't just a building I had bought. It was his way of life, his control, that I had upended. The calls and messages kept coming. My dad tried a more diplomatic approach, offering to help me with more real estate ventures if I was willing to negotiate the rent. My mom, too, would message me, asking if I would consider meeting halfway with the rent increase. But I stood firm. I wasn't playing their game anymore. At times, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. Not because of the rent increase, not because of the building, but because of what it had done to my relationship with them. The distance between us was growing. I didn't talk to them as much as I used to. They didn't understand why I wasn't taking the easy way out. They didn't understand why I couldn't just let things go back to normal. But I knew that normal was the last thing I wanted. Normal had always meant being second best. Normal had always meant living under their shadow. And yet, despite everything, there were still moments of doubt. When I saw them, especially my mom, there were flashes of the girl I used to be, the girl who wanted nothing more than their approval. I would catch her eye, and for a brief moment, I could see the disappointment in her gaze. Maybe she thought she had failed me. Maybe she thought I was throwing everything away. And then, just as quickly, that look would harden, and she would return to her role of trying to make things right by offering solutions I had already turned down. The hardest part was dealing with the realization that no matter what I did, they would never see me as I saw myself. They would always see me through the lens of who they wanted me to be. And while that used to bother me, now it was just a bitter fact I had to accept. They would never be the ones to understand my journey. They would never get it. But that didn't matter anymore. What mattered now was the journey I was on, one where I was defining myself, not by their standards, but by my own. I was building something. Something real. And that meant everything to me. Ryan and Dad might not see it now, but they would eventually. As the months passed, I settled into my new role as the owner of the building. I wasn't just collecting rent, though. I was learning the ins and outs of property management, expanding my portfolio, and growing into the businesswoman I had always known I could be. Slowly but surely, I started to find my footing. I had carved out a place for myself in the real world, and it felt incredible. But the most satisfying part wasn't just the money or the sense of achievement. It was the subtle way my parents and Ryan began to realize that I wasn't a side character in their story anymore. They had underestimated me, assumed that I would remain that quiet, overlooked girl who could never amount to anything. The first big blow came when they realized how much the rent increase had truly affected them. My dad, who had been so confident at the beginning, started showing signs of stress. His firm had been dealing with a steady stream of clients, but the new rent was a burden. They had to scramble to make up the difference, and even with Ryan's newfound role at the company, the financial strain was apparent. My dad started calling less. My mom stopped asking for favors. I could see the cracks starting to show, and it wasn't long before I realized they were feeling the weight of their own pride. One day, my dad finally reached out to me, without his usual bravado. "Iris," he said over the phone, his voice quieter than usual. "I wanted to talk about the rent. We've been struggling a bit with the increase. I know I pushed you on this, but maybe we can figure something out." "Maybe we can," I cut him off, surprised at the tone in his voice. "I'm not negotiating on the rent, Dad. You made it clear a year ago that you didn't think I could handle things. I've worked hard for everything I have now, and I'm not going to back down just because it's inconvenient for you." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for the first time in a long time, I could sense him taking a step back. I had expected him to fight back, but instead, there was a strange quiet. It was as though the power had shifted completely, and for the first time in my life, I could feel him trying to understand my position. "I get it," he said, finally. "Maybe I was too hard on you. I guess I didn't really see you, not like I should have. I thought you were just the artsy one. The dreamer. But you've really done something here. I just didn't expect this." It wasn't an apology, but it was something close to it. And honestly, that was enough for me. The fact that he had acknowledged my achievements, even if in a roundabout way, was something I had never thought I'd hear from him. Still, I wasn't going to let him off easy. My victory wasn't about receiving validation from them, it was about showing that I was capable of creating my own path. But I had to admit, hearing those words felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. It wasn't the closure I'd expected, but it was a step in the right direction. A few months later, things really began to come full circle. Ryan, who had always felt untouchable, started feeling the pressure of the situation more than anyone. The firm had always been his safety net, but now that their expenses were higher and their profits weren't growing as quickly as expected, he found himself at a crossroads. His image, the one he'd built over the years as the golden child, began to fray. One evening, I received a call from Ryan. It was late, and I hadn't heard from him in a while. I hadn't expected to hear from him at all, given the tension that had built between us. "Iris," he said, his voice tight, "can we talk? I need your help." I had never heard him sound this vulnerable. For a split second, I considered ignoring the call. But something inside me told me I needed to hear him out. "I'm listening," I said. "I can't do this anymore. The pressure from Dad, from the firm, it's getting to me. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I thought I could just coast by, but now, everything is falling apart. I don't even know who I am in all of this." It wasn't the apology I had imagined, but it was real. Ryan was at a crossroads, and for the first time, I saw him as someone who wasn't just the privileged son of a successful businessman, but as someone who was struggling to make sense of his own life. "Ryan," I said, taking a deep breath, "this is your chance to figure it out. I'm not going to hand you any solutions. You've been running on easy mode for so long. But you don't have to keep doing this. The way you've been acting, the way you've treated me, it's not going to last forever. You have to face up to your own mistakes." I paused, letting my words sink in. There was a long silence on the other end, and when Ryan spoke again, his voice was different. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've been an idiot. I've treated you like you were nothing. I guess I never really saw you. But I see you now. And I don't know what to do next." It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was something. It was the first time I'd ever heard my brother admit that he had been wrong, and it felt like a victory in its own right. Weeks later, I got a letter from Dad's firm. They had been hit with a significant financial loss. Despite their best efforts, they couldn't keep up with the rising costs, including the inflated rent on the building. They were forced to downsize and move out of the building I owned. The letter was polite but firm, acknowledging their inability to maintain their lease. It was exactly what I'd expected, but it didn't make it any less satisfying. The firm had been my dad's world. The place he had built from the ground up. And now, they were losing it, not because I had sabotaged them, but because they had underestimated me and thought they could continue taking advantage of me. As I read the letter, I could almost hear the quiet rage in my dad's voice, the frustration of having to admit defeat. He had always seen himself as the one with control, and now, in a small way, I had taken that from him. It wasn't about revenge in the way some might imagine. There was no grand explosion, no dramatic showdown. It was more like watching a slow burn, a quiet acknowledgement that I had finally turned the tables. I never saw the satisfaction of watching them leave. By the time they made the decision to downsize, I had already moved on with my life. I was running my own business, making real moves in the real estate world, and living a life that felt entirely my own. But there was something deeply satisfying about knowing that the game had changed. For the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't just a secondary character in their story. I had written my own, and it was a story where I was in control.